Have you ever tried to get the right exposure with strobes and struggle? Well, after this video, you'll know exactly the variables that work together to help you nail that exposure with strobes every time. When you're working with strobes in the studio, getting your exposure right can seem a little bit tricky because with natural light or continuous light, you can actually see in your viewfinder or on your screen what you're going to get. You can rely on things like exposure simulation or your histogram preview or even just your eye. But with strobes, you are working with short bursts of light that are only visible after you take the photo. So you can't actually see the exposure until the flash fires, the image records, and you look at the back of your camera. So this means that strobes behave differently, which can be a little bit confusing unless you understand the variables that are involved. So don't worry, once you understand what you're working with, it really is pretty straightforward. And so I'm going to break it down for you. There are four main variables that affect your strobe exposure. They are aperture, ISO, the power of your light, and the distance of your light. Now here's one thing that does not affect strobe exposure, and that is shutter speed. As long as you're within your camera's sync speed, which for most cameras is around 1/200th or 1/250th of a second, your shutter speed does not affect your strobe exposure at all because no matter how long your exposure is, the strobe is only firing for a fraction of a second. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into these four, and I want to begin first with aperture and ISO because you're probably already familiar with these for controlling exposure. Both of these camera settings directly affect how bright or dark your image appears. When you go with a wider aperture, it lets in more light, which means the image becomes brighter. And if you increase your ISO, it also makes your image brighter. Now this is just like it is with continuous light. Now a quick note on aperture. Remember, it controls depth of field. So if you're shooting a group, you'll definitely want to keep your subject in focus, so you have to keep that in mind when you're working on your exposure. You might want to start with, let's say, f11 for a group, and then you want to change the other variables to try to get you to correct exposure rather than going to a wider aperture, which will affect your depth of field. Next up is the power of your light. Strobes allow you to adjust how bright the flash is. You dial the power up to give you more light, you dial it down to give you less. It's super simple. And finally, we have the distance of light. The closer the light is to your subject, the brighter it will be. And then the further away, the darker. And so I can kind of move it in and out to adjust exposure, but also know when I move the light, it affects the spread and quality of light. So for example, when I bring the light in closer, it gets brighter, but it also gets softer. So now you have an understanding of the four tools at your disposal: your aperture, your ISO, the power of the light, and the distance of light. And you can mix and match them. Use a little bit of one, a little bit of the other in order to get the exposure just right. But here's the real challenge. How do you know when the exposure is right? And so you have a couple different approaches. Our first option is we're going to use something called a histogram. Even without a fancy tool called a light meter, which we'll get to later, your camera gives you another powerful variable. This is a graph that shows you the brightness values in your image. So when you look at it, over on the left-hand side are your shadows, the middle are the midtones, and the right are your highlights. So if your subject is holding up a gray card, what you'll see is kind of a spike in the middle of the frame because it's some middle exposure. Some of these gray cards actually have a white, a gray, and a black, and so you can get the entire tonal range. Now, this isn't about being perfect, but it gives you a baseline to work with. All right, so let's actually see that in action. All right, so I want to take you through how I work through the process in my head of getting the correct exposure if I'm not using a light meter. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a test shot and we just set the light up. I don't know the exposure. We're going to see what that's giving us, and then I'm going to analyze it. Now for my camera lens today, I'm going to be shooting with the Canon R5 Mark II and then my favorite lens, which is the RF 24-105. All right, so let's give a little test here. All right, so the first thing I can do when I look at this image is I can just use my own judgment. How does the exposure look to me? And so I can judge like her skin tone and the color of the background based on what it looks like to my eye. But remember, strobes, it's not what you see is what you get, right? So right now what I'm actually seeing on her with my eye is the modeling light. The strobe exposure was when it flashed. So as I look at this, kind of look back towards her actual skin tone, I think it looks a little bit underexposed. And so if you're just guessing, you can see where this really does become a guessing game because I'm just kind of going with what do I think looks good. So let's say I think it's a little underexposed. Well, what variables do I have to play with? The first thing I could do is I could bump up my ISO or open up my aperture. So let's actually go, I'm at f11. ISO 200, 1/200th of a second. So instead of f11, I don't need that much depth of field. Maybe I go to f8. So I'm gonna take the same frame where I opened up a full stop. So opening up a full stop, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of in between the two, right? As I look at it, I think it's a little bit too bright now. So I adjusted my aperture. The other thing that I could do is I could lower my ISO. I could also close down my aperture a little bit, go back to where I was at, but let's go, instead of ISO 200, let's go down to like ISO 160, a third of a stop darker. And I think that that looks a little bit better, a little bit more true to life. So once again, clearly it's guessing. So what can we do to try to get some of the guesswork out of the equation? All right, so first and foremost, right now I'm shooting in Capture One. However, you could also be shooting to Lightroom and have a similar effect. I'm doing something called tethering. So as I'm taking the picture, I'm using this cable. It's called the Tether Tools tether cable. It's connected to my computer, and as I'm taking the images, it's coming up in Capture One. I find this to be really, really useful for helping me to judge exposure, to judge focus, because trying to judge this on the back of the camera, it's not really consistent. Plus, you can actually adjust the brightness of the screen on the back of your camera, which means what you are looking at could be too dark or too light and just not accurate. So either I like to judge it on my computer, or we come back around to the histogram. So you can access a histogram in your camera, or you can access it in either Lightroom or Capture One. So when I look at a histogram, you can kind of see it up here in the left-hand corner. What this is reading for me is, if I actually like dissect this, in the left hand, this is going to be our darkest black. So I have some really dark areas. Well, now if I look over to her, it makes sense because that would be her hair. Then I see this other little spike, and that is probably, since it's the biggest piece of information, it's probably the background, right? It's a slightly darker area where there's a lot of information. A slightly darker area that covers a lot of the photo is the background. And then it's pretty much the same, except for like a little bump over here on the right, and that is likely the highlights in her skin. Okay, once again, it's guessing, but guess what? If I mouse over the photo, do you see how there's a little line on the histogram that moves as I move my pointer? And so it's actually showing me at that specific part of the photo where it's represented on the histogram. So what I just said was right. In the hair, that is the darkest blacks on the left-hand side. On the background, yep, that's that little spike on the left-hand side of the histogram. And then, yep, the highlights over there to the right are her face. So basically what you want to make sure is that what you're seeing represented in the histogram makes sense to the scene. It is still a little bit of guesswork, but if it's way underexposed or way overexposed, it'll be very obvious in the histogram. So again, you can do this with tethering, or you can bring up a histogram in the back of your camera when you're reviewing your image. So now what I'm going to do is try to take a little bit of guesswork out of the equation by using a gray card. I'm using the Calibrite color checker. So this is going to be about a medium gray. So if I put this so that it's lit by the same illumination as the subject, and I take a close-up on it, this spike should be somewhere near the middle of the histogram if we are correctly exposed. All right, so let's take a look at what we're seeing in this image. I filled most of the frame with this medium gray. So let's look back over at our histogram. It's telling me that I have some dark areas on the left. That is likely her hair. Then I have a dark spike that's a lot of information. That's probably the background. But then look what happens right in the middle of the histogram. There is some information that gives us a little spike, and that is going to be exactly what I told you. It is the gray card that we're seeing here. And it's located where it's supposed to be. If it was shifted too far to the right or too far to the left, it would tell me that I'm under or overexposed. So this is a helpful tool to help you feel a little bit more confident that you're not just guessing at the correct exposure. And by the way, this is a smaller gray card, but they have ones that are pop-up that you can do larger. There's a lot of different solutions. They even make neutral gray lens cloth. So it'd be something that you could multi-purpose and then hold it up in your frame. So you don't always have to bring something extra with you. This is the one that I bring with me on my shoots because it actually dual purposes for allowing me to get correct skin tones and white balance in the shot. So as you can see, you don't need to buy a lot of expensive extra tools to help you get the correct exposure in the studio, but you're still making a little bit of judgments. What do you do if you want to have precision and make sure it truly is the correct exposure? That's what we're going to talk about next. So another way to get the correct exposure that is much more precise is about using a light meter. And this is really important if you need to be able to exactly repeat a setup, or if you just want to make sure you really are accurate. A light meter, what it does is it measures the amount of light falling onto your subject, what light is hitting them. And so here's the basics of how you might use a light meter. So the first step is you set an ISO on your camera as well as the meter. Then you take the meter at the subject's face with the dome pointed towards the light, and you're going to flash the strobe, and you're going to get a reading. So let's say it's f5.6. From there, you have two choices. Your first choice is with that 5.6, you can adjust your camera's aperture to match the reading. So change your camera aperture to 5.6 and you'll have correct exposure. Your other option, however, is that you decide what aperture you want. So let's say you need more depth of field, so you set your camera to f11. Then what you're going to do is take meter readings and adjust the power of the light up and down until it reads the aperture on your camera. In both of these cases, your shutter speed stays the same, usually around 1/200th of a second. You kind of ignore that. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a look at the basics of the light meter in action. All right, so now I'm grabbing my light meter, and the light meter I'm using here is from a company called Sekonic. They have a variety of different models, and honestly, if you're just getting into studio strobes, the simplest model is going to do the trick because you just need to read the power from the strobe. As you build up to fancier models, it does other things that, maybe it's working with video or continuous light, but not anything that you need. So what I need to do first is I need to set my ISO in order for this to work. We're going to match the ISO to what is set on my camera. So from before, we are at ISO 200, and I'm going to set my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second. However, that doesn't matter. The shutter speed is not actually going to affect anything. So now I want to see, what is this light actually reading? How much light is hitting the subject for ISO 200. So on the right-hand side of the meter here, I'm going to hit this button that prepares it to take the exposure. And I'm also going to make sure that the dome is out so that it is collecting the light. So I'm going to point it towards the strobe. So it is telling me that that light is giving me f7.0. Before, when I was using the histogram and I was using the gray card, I had put the exposure at f8. F7 and F8 are super close. They're basically like 1/3 of a stop different. So I actually did a pretty good job figuring it out by eye. That being said, if I want it to be exact, I can turn up the power of my light. Now the light that I'm using here is I'm using a Profoto Pro D3 and a 4-foot octabox. And what's nice is that Profoto has a whole bunch of triggers that allows you to control the power to 1/10 of a stop. So I can increase by like 1/3 of a stop and take the meter reading again. So after going up 1/3 of a stop, that gives me f8. So this is telling me that the correct exposure at ISO 200 with this light is f8. So I'm going to make sure my camera is still set to f8. We'll take a shot and see what it's telling me is the correct exposure. So shooting at f8 with the light meter reading f8 is giving me the correct exposure. All right, so from there, I just want to show you one more thing. Let's assume that you take your meter reading, and I'm just changing the power of the light. We're just going to kind of guess here, okay? I'm going to take a meter reading again. When I turned down the power of the light, it gave me a reading of f5. So what I could do is what we did before and turn up the light until it reads f8, but the other approach is I can change the aperture on my camera. So I can change the aperture to f5, and once again, it will give me a correct exposure because we are matching the two. So let's see f5, same thing. So taking a look at these two, here is where I changed the strobe to read f8 because I chose f8 as my aperture. Here is where I took the meter reading, it said f5, so I changed my camera so the aperture read f5. Both of them give me the exact same exposure. All right, so obviously our light meter is a very useful tool to take the guesswork out of things. Of course, it's something else you need to buy, but if you want to be precise and you need to be able to repeat a setup so it's identical in the future, then this is something that would be indispensable. While these approaches technically give you a correct exposure, remember, you're the artist, you get to make that call. So for example, when I'm photographing skin tones for beauty work, I often overexpose a little bit because it's a more luminous look. It's a creative choice, but what I recommend is you start with the proper exposure and then you can intentionally make adjustments from there. Once you understand how strobe exposure really works and how you can balance these variables of aperture, ISO, the distance of your strobe and the power of the strobe, these variables allow you to shoot more confidently, more consistently, and of course with more creative control. So as you can see, there is a lot to consider when you are working with studio strobes, and you really have to understand that getting the right exposure works differently than it does with continuous or natural light. But once you understand what goes into it, it's really not that overwhelming. There are just a few things that are extra that you have to consider. Now, if you would like to really truly understand lighting, from the very basics up to intermediate or advanced, I actually have a course called Master Studio Lighting that will give you the confidence you need to work in the studio, and I've linked to that in the description below. And for this video, if you want to see the tools I use, from the strobe to my camera and lens, as well as the light meter, the gray card, all of that information you can find in the description as well. And if you're going to pick those up, of course, you want to pick them up at Adorama.com. Thanks everybody for watching, and I have so many more videos just like this one, so be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time, guys.